Good. Well, why don't we open this up to all of you? I've had too much fun being able to ask Gary questions here and get the opportunity frequently. So this isn't a shy crowd. Also, tell us who you are when you all start off, because you guys are all getting to know each other.
Well, Gary knows me. I'm Desmond Butler with DEP. In the spirit of your suggestion that we look into other programs, because of the bluster, we hear a lot about Russia.
Right.
But in the burgeoning arms race, how does China fit into the picture?
So I think China, unlike the US and Russia, China still is deeply committed to what we used to call a counter-value strategy. For those of you who don't know Cold War terminology, counter-value means that basically targeting cities. And the Chinese calculation is that if they can hold at risk a small number of American cities, I don't know how many.
They have too many cities for us to hit.
Well, I mean, they're worried about deterring us, right? So as long as they have enough missiles that can survive a U.S. attack, conventional and nuclear, in order to destroy a dozen or so American cities, that will deter us from attacking them. And I think what they're doing is keeping themselves in a position where they're confident that they have that capability, taking into account our missile defense system. So the Chinese, for many years, they were content with a very small, very vulnerable nuclear force that was primarily based in silos. And over the last 20 years or more, they've now moved to mobile land-based missiles. They're trying to field a better class of submarines that can get, out of coastal waters and into deep water. Probably not doing much on bombers, but they're working on, hypersonic, just like we and the Russians are. So I think the Chinese, in a way, even though counter-value is not very moral, it's a very economical way to achieve nuclear deterrence. And I think the Chinese are, continue to be committed to just enough numbers and modernization so that we don't have any kind of option to disarm them without facing the risk of an unacceptable loss of civilian life. And and I should say, and I think they'll achieve that. I think Chinese have all the technology and money they need to achieve that level of deterrence.
Jennifer Griffin with Fox News. Gary, when did the Russians begin modernizing their nuclear forces, and what role did the Poland missile defense shield, when we were talking about that, play in escalating that situation? And as far as you know, why is the top State Department North Korean negotiator leaving?
So I haven't talked to Joe. I don't know why he's leaving. To me, it's very peculiar because on the surface, we're very close to being able to begin talks with the North Koreans to set terms and conditions for beginning nuclear negotiations. So this is a terrible time for Joe to be leaving. And I don't know if there's some story about why he's leaving or why he's been asked to leave at this particular moment. But it's very, very poor timing. And I've been saying to my friends in the Trump administration and to others, the one thing Trump could do that would really kickstart any diplomatic process is to appoint a senior presidential envoy to represent him in the discussions with the North Koreans. Because we need somebody who can talk to the North Korean foreign minister, Lee Young-ho. And Joe, is a great guy, but he just doesn't have the rank to talk to Lee Young-ho, who clearly is Kim Jong-un's sort of man to handle the Americans. So I would
choose? Who would you choose?
Oh, it doesn't really matter very much. I mean, President Trump likes generals. There are lots of former commanders of U.S. forces in Korea who are happily in retirement. Any of them would be just fine. You just got to get a person, a point person who actually is responsible for the negotiations. Right now, I mean, not only don't know what our position is, I don't know what we actually are asking for as a condition for beginning negotiations. I don't even know who has responsibility for meeting with the North Koreans to convey that message.
One of the oddities of all this is the North Koreans view our power structure differently than we do. So when President Obama, I think you had left the office by this time, had to go find somebody to go get 2 Americans out of North Korea. I remember Bill Clinton went in 2009. They looked around and they sent Jim Clapper, who was, this sort of hard-bitten the only old Cold Warrior left in the Obama administration and looked like he could have been the father of many of the people who were in the administration. And it worked brilliantly because he showed up, and the North Koreans basically thought that after the president, he was the next most powerful person in the country because he was the director of national intelligence. And in their world, his equivalent, who was the head of the Reconnaissance General Bureau, was the next most powerful person in the country. Right? So he and the head of the RGA went off and had dinner, and after this delightful dinner, they stuck Clapper with the bill.
That's North Korea.
Yeah, Anne Marie, you can remember that for tonight.
So
Let's
to
see.
answer your question about the Russia, as David said, Russia inherited a really creaky strategic forces from the Soviet Union. I mean, systems that were very vulnerable, like the silo-based missiles, or that didn't work very well, like the submarines or bombers that were really antiquated. So the modernization program has been going on for at least 20 years, but it's been starved of resources, and there have been a lot of technical problems. I think the Russians in the last 10 years have made significant progress in terms of fielding road mobile ICBMs, which moves them away from being vulnerable to first strike. And they've had a series of tests for their new submarine launched missile, which seems to be working okay. So the Russians will put in enough resources to have a secure arsenal, but it's going to, and as I said, for them it's a very, very high priority. So they will spend a lot of money on their nuclear forces, when in a way maybe that's good, because it's better than spending it on tanks and airplanes that might actually be useful.
You got at my question somewhat. I'm Spencer Ackerman with the Daily Beast. How much is Russia putting into modernization, particularly in the context of what Putin's announced today?
Yeah.
And how equipped is the Russian economy to absorb that cost? And depending on your answer, I may have a follow-up.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know the sort of monetary amount, but my guess is that there's enough money in the Russian system for them. And keep in mind, this is not a new investment, right? They've been building these systems for many years. So I don't know that Putin's speech today necessarily indicates any change in actual funding. They may just be continuing with programs that have been in place for a long time. This nuclear torpedo, they've been working on it for well over a decade.
I mean, you could still argue, like, much with the dream of a directed energy missile defense,
Right.
All you really have to do is just say it, not necessarily put substantial amounts of money into it, because the technology is so sort of distant. But what I'm I guess sort of asking at is, what we saw from the nuclear posture review is something that's going to cost the United States
I know.
something like $1 trillion+ over 30
Yeah.
years. Conservatively, are the Russians making a comparable investment, or have they basically gotten themselves in the enviable circumstance of describing and having done something just scary enough and just affordable enough to prompt the United States at a moment of economic uncertainty into doing something tremendously expensive and leveraging their nuclear arsenal and nuclear strategy in an economic direction?
Well, I think both Obama and Trump have committed to spending extraordinarily expensive, a lot of money to replace our current fleet of land-based, submarine-based missiles and heavy bombers. Whether we actually go through with that entire program over 20 years, I think that remains to be seen. Including some of these new weapons that were announced, like the submarine-launched cruise missile. Let's see whether we actually spend that, because I think in the out years, I'm guessing that people will look for ways to shave down that price tag, maybe with a couple of less submarines or a couple of less missiles, or not developing some new systems. But I think any way you look at it, we're going to spend a huge amount of money over the next 20 years because we need to have a modern triad, and all of our systems are nearing the end of their service life.
Okay, most of the money here we're discussing is actually not on the weapons, it's in
It's
the
on the delivery systems. So
It's all in the submarines
especially the submarines.
and the new bombers.
Yeah.
Did you spend much time in your time in office looking seriously at the question of, could we just get rid of the land-based system, and if so, would it save a lot?
Well, the answer to your first question is yes. I think we could maintain strategic stability without the land-based missiles, especially because they're silo-based. From a theoretical standpoint, that's the worst kind of missiles to have. because they're tempting targets, right? You want to have mobile missiles, which cannot be struck first. So we're spending an awful lot of money on systems that, in theory, are not stabilizing. But I also think it's politically impossible to imagine that we would dispense with the land-based leg of the triad unless there was a dramatic transformation in U.S.-Russian relations.
There were big employment.
Well, it's partly that. There's the missile lobby, but it's also just strategically, I just don't see how any president would be comfortable. And the truth is, we can't afford it, right? It's going to cost money, but we can't afford it.
Sure. Idris Ali from Reuters. Two questions. Whenever I cover the Pentagon and ask this, Jen, whenever we're at the Pentagon and there is a North Korean missile launch, there's been a bit of a gap, and even if it explodes at the launch pad, they never call it a failure. They say it just exploded at the launch pad, because obviously they're learning from each missile test. It seems like re-entry is one of the last big things that remains. Sort of what else do they need to have a sort of an actual threat to the U.S.? And sort of the second question, unrelated, is the SLBM and the SLICM.
Right.
The deterrence theory is, some agree with it, some don't. Do you think that that's actually a deterrent, or do today's sort of events just show that it really hasn't deterred anything? It's actually leading to a bigger problem.
Right. So on the first, as far as I can tell, the North Koreans have never demonstrated a successful reentry vehicle for a long-range missile. They have plenty of times for their short and intermediate range missiles, like the no-dogs. So that's why I say I assume that the North Koreans are able to deliver a nuclear weapon to Tokyo or Seoul with a missile, because they've demonstrated that over and over again. I don't think we really know, because it's not a question of capability to attack the United States with a missile. It's a question of reliability, right? It's a question of percentages. It's not yes or no. So they do a lot of work, on the ground simulating reentry vehicles, simulating heat and vibration. And, if they fired 10 missiles at the United States, maybe one would work, right? We just don't know. And I hope we never find out. But it's certainly true that they've never demonstrated a test where a reentry vehicle has worked. And until they do that, I think we'll continue to say that they probably don't have a reliable capability to attack the U.S. with missile. I emphasize with missile because that's only one way to deliver nuclear weapons. The North Koreans can, attack us with a nuclear weapon today with a ship. Or they can, detonate a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere and produce a so-called EMP effect, which would do a lot of damage to the electrical system. So our fixation with a nuclear-armed missile is a little limited in the sense that North Korea's had nuclear weapons for 10 years. So they have lots of ways to attack us besides the missiles.
Gary, a related question to that. What difference would it make to the Trump administration's calculations if the North Koreans conducted a test, maybe an atmospheric test, that actually did seem to demonstrate that they solved the reentry problem? Does that raise considerably the chances of a unilateral strike?
No, I think it makes it much less likely. Because if once the North Koreans demonstrate with some credibility that they can destroy an American city with a nuclear weapon, what president would run the risk of attacking North Korea if you told him, sir, we may not get all of them. They may have a couple that survive and destroy Los Angeles and New York.
Many in the administration, I think McMaster probably included, would argue the other side of that the one thing no American president, Democrat or Republican, could tolerate would be a North Korea that can a proven ability to reach any American city, and therefore a hand would be forced.
Well, that's certainly what they're saying. And I am sure that McMaster believes it, that if North Korea keeps testing, our hand will be forced. But as I said, the options available to us militarily are either extraordinarily costly and dangerous, or they're not likely to be effective. But I think once the North Koreans show they have it, then it becomes very hard to argue that you can carry out an attack, with impunity. You asked the question on the. You're talking about the NPR argument for why we need a tactical nuclear weapon
Sure,
delivered
has that
by...
gone out of the door with sort of
Right.
Putin's...
So, I mean, I'm very skeptical about the argument that we need additional tactical nuclear weapons, because we already have tactical nuclear weapons, including weapons based in Europe, both bombs and air-launched cruise missiles. So I think, you know, if there was a war between NATO and Russia, we already have available tactical nuclear weapons if the conflict ever escalated to the point where it was necessary. But at the same time, I doubt that having a couple of additional types of tactical nuclear weapons make much of a difference either way. I mean, I think that Putin is very unlikely to, you know, attack a NATO ally, which would lead to military conflict with NATO and which could escalate to a nuclear conflict. And we're very unlikely to defend countries that are outside NATO. So if the Russians, you know, invade Ukraine or invade Belarus, we're not going to come to their rescue with military forces.
Just to follow up on David's question, how, if you were in the administration, how would you respond to an atmospheric test by North Korea?
I mean, there'd be more sanctions. You know, as I said, we've been very effective. The administration has been very effective in imposing sanctions against North Korea in response to the testing campaign. So if there was an atmospheric test, I think that would give us, you know, we'd be able to go to the Chinese and convince them to take additional action.
Edward Long from the New York Times. To follow up on that, I mean, you just laid out the case that none of the policies have worked, including sanctions, but you now say, oh, you would use sanctions if there were an atmospheric test. What's the logic behind that?
Well, the logic is sanctions give you bargaining chips to negotiate limits, to constrain the program. So I assume that North Korea will remain as a nuclear-armed country for as long as it survives as an independent country. In other words, it's like the other countries with nuclear weapons. And the question is, do you want them, you know, if you could negotiate limits on the program, numbers of weapons, numbers of missiles, or you could delay their acquisition of further capabilities, is that worth doing? I think it is. It's arms control. So I think deterrence works better if the North Korean program is limited than if it's unlimited, and sanctions give you bargaining leverage.
But Ed's essentially getting to the two big lies of the North Korea policy. Lie number one is that we can have a negotiation that will result in their giving up all of their nuclear weapons and their missiles. And lie number two is that sanctions will get you there when the CIA itself has estimated in public that no amount of sanction is going to get them to give up all the nuclear weapons. So these two giant contradictions, when you ask people in the administration about it, they kind of look at you like, well, that's the policy.
But to be clear, I think we should continue, even though we know it's not achievable, we should continue to say our ultimate objective is a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. I think once it appears that we've given up and that we're prepared to tolerate North Korea having nuclear weapons forever, I think it puts much more pressure on Korea and Japan to develop their own nuclear weapons. And the credibility of our assurances to Seoul and Tokyo, you know, as I said, I don't think there's an immediate danger that they will develop nuclear weapons, but I do think there's a longer-term danger that over time they'll decide the only way they can really protect themselves and deter North Korea is if they have their own nuclear weapons, and they don't have to depend on the U.S. to defend them at a time when U.S. cities will be in jeopardy. So I'm trying to, you know, prevent further spread of nuclear weapons in Asia, and I think one way you do that is by making clear that, you know, our objective is to disarm North Korea, and we're trying to achieve that through a series of, you know, interim steps over a very long period of time.
Usha Sahai from More on the Rocks. Some experts over the last year, I think, have expressed a little bit of frustration at sort of the nature of mainstream press coverage of national security issues, given that, you know, it tends to be a little bit breathless. It tends to sort of, understandably, I think, be tinged by the sort of chaotic political moment that we're in. For both of you, what is your advice for, you know, in a fast-moving and tough news environment, how to sort of cover kind of the change that we're seeing, but also some of the continuity, for example, with the nuclear posture review, with perspective and sort of provide insight on the changes and the difficulties that we're seeing, but also keep in mind some of the things that maybe haven't changed as much? How can reporters kind of navigate that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I'm sorry to say, but I'm afraid a lot of the atmosphere in Washington has become so poisonous that people that are otherwise reasonable and balanced have really become sucked into that kind of tendency, either to criticize or defend President Trump, because for some people some of my friends, he is so objectionable that even though, in my view, the nuclear posture review is not a radical departure, they can't bring themselves to acknowledge that, in fact, Trump's policy is not very different from Obama's. Whatever Trump does has to be the end of the world. And I think that's really damages our public discourse. I mean, I have a lot of objections to Trump too, but I have to say that on national security policy, he's said a lot of stupid things, but he actually hasn't done very much. I mean, this is as opposed to climate change, where he really did pull out of the Paris Agreement, or trade, where we're now, he pulled out of TPP and we're entering into what, maybe a series of trade actions. But on national security policy, he actually hasn't done, I would argue, hasn't done anything that's wildly reckless or even that different from Obama, beyond the noise. But you'd never know that talking to the experts in Washington. I think there's a tendency for people who, understandably find Trump so objectionable to let their analysis be colored.
I guess I'd try this from the reporters who from two other data points. One, in agreement with Gary, the North Korea policy has been a lot better than it sounded. If you turned off the tweets and you got rid of the fire and fury, and
Right.
I was with Tillerson when he said in Beijing, that we've got a few lines open to North Korea, a couple lines, and we alerted this and put it out. And of course, Trump doesn't read any alerts, doesn't read anything on phone, but he does read the print paper. And at 8 a.m. his time, the next morning, when he saw this leading the New York Times, comes the "Give it up, Rex. They only respond to one thing." Which I thought Tillerson was actually going to quit that day. He probably now wishes that maybe he had considered that. But I do think the pressure campaign has actually been better. And actually, one of the hardest questions to go ask the Obama folks is, tell me why it is that you couldn't have done in sanctions to North Korea everything that Trump just did. And they say, well, you didn't have the big testing run of earlier this
I
year.
think that's right.
And the answer is, yeah, you did have a big one in 13 and 14.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, certainly in 2016, when Kim Jong-un really started the aggressive testing campaign, Obama did get 2 good UN Security Council resolutions in the last year of his presidency.
Right.
And that testing campaign carried over into Trump's presidency, and he got 2 really good Security Council resolutions. So I think, credit for the UN Security Council resolutions, it really goes to Kim Jong-un. We never could have gotten the Chinese to agree if it wasn't for his behavior.
And the other thing is, Obama did start the cyber program against missiles. Now, how effective it was in the end, it had an 88%, we had 88% failure on the Musadan missile. How much of that was from cyber and how much of that was in the fact that North Koreans don't weld very well, I don't know. But when they switched to the current program, and then they haven't launched a Musadan since October of 2016, whatever magic was happening, they seem to have solved. Yeah. So anyway, there's one more back here. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Varghese George. I work with the Hindu from India. So we discussed China as a partner and as a threat. What actually is China? Is it a threat or a partner in this context?
In the nuclear context?
Yes.
Well, it's a threat. We imagine when we sit down and think about nuclear war, right? There's a part of the U.S. government whose job is to imagine nuclear war. It's first Russia. That's the main driver in terms of our force posture, because the Russians have so many nuclear weapons and they pose an existential threat. And then China. So the U.S. size and deployment of our nuclear forces is based on fighting a nuclear war, if necessary, at the same time or sequentially against Russia and China. And our forces are sized to destroy both countries if it comes to a nuclear war. And that's it. Nobody thinks about, North Korea or India or Pakistan or, I mean, none of the other nuclear weapon states are really seen as a nuclear threat that has any, significant consequence for U.S. force planning or, strategic doctrine or any of that.
Follow up if I may. The U.S. strategy about North Korea is largely accounting for, or I would say even dependent on what China does, as we've been discussing, and including what President Trump has been saying and talking about. So in that context, how does China's perception as a threat fit in?
So I think, China has a very ambivalent view toward North Korea, that on one hand, they want the North Korean regime to survive and they want it to be successful because they see it as an important way to, balance the U.S. position in Asia, which the Chinese see as their, primary area of competition with the United States, so who's the dominant country in Asia. But at the same time, the Chinese recognize that North Korea's nuclear and missile program is damaging China's national interests because it gives the U.S., in China's view, opportunity to expand our defense relationship in the region, especially with Japan and Korea, including in missile defense, which the Chinese see as a threat to their strategic forces. So the Chinese are trying to balance conflicting interests. And then on top of that, I think the North Koreans make them very nervous. That they're afraid that if they push too hard, Kim Jong-un will do something that could lead to conflict on the Korean Peninsula. But, and so the Chinese are balancing these, conflicting interests, and Kim Jong-un has moved them in the direction of being willing to apply more pressure because the Chinese are so angry and frustrated that he continues to, advance the program in a way that in China's view is very irresponsible. Now, I think the really interesting question is U.S.-China relations under Trump, and that's kind of a really interesting area, which, on one hand, as I said, the Trump administration has worked very well with China to increase sanctions against North Korea. On the other hand, we have to see how the rest of the relationship plays out, especially in the economic area, with these new trade sanctions coming, and I understand there are intellectual property rights sanctions that are likely to come, and that'll be, I think, fascinating to see how the administration balances what is essentially a cooperative relationship on North Korea versus what is a competitive and hostile relationship in the trade area or the economic area.
So we have time for just two more. So we'll start with you since you haven't had one yet.
My name's Erica Pady and I'm with Axios. And you mentioned one thing that's kind of undercovered is the nuclear programs of foreign countries. So what would be, and this is for you too, David, what would be some strategies for reporters to educate themselves on the nuclear program of like China or Pakistan or India?
Well, there are people, of course, specialists who work on that field, right? So you could talk to people in Washington and in the country and academia and think tanks who work on that. But obviously the best thing would be to find, foreign sources who are willing to talk. And again, you'd have to go to the same academics and people in think tanks and maybe some government officials. I mean, I know it's not easy. It's because obviously people are reluctant to talk about national security secrets, especially if they're, in danger of being prosecuted.
Yeah.
I'll give you one example from this. It was the investigation into A.Q. Khan and his network. This was one of the founders of the Pakistani program, who then went on to figure out that the way to great profits was to go sell much of that technology to, we found Libya, Iran, and North Korea. There were probably a couple of others. The U.S. government was of absolutely no help, this was during the Bush administration, on this story because they were trying to get the Pakistanis to cooperate on counterterrorism stuff. This was post 9/11. They needed access through Pakistan to get the troops in Afghanistan. But we knew that they were trying slowly to build a case against A.Q. Khan. So they had briefed a lot of members of the Security Council, including the non-permanent members, many of whom had never seen a nuclear briefing like this. So we got on a bunch of airplanes and started flying around the world to get them to go through the American briefing with us. And we found several who would do it. And then we came back to Washington and we said, look, we've got your briefing. Okay, here's what, so hear copies of it, okay? And at that moment, we actually did get people to go talk about it. They wouldn't talk on the record. And what was interesting about this was after we published the story, it was a 14-month investigation. It was a very long, one of these, like open the paper and have 2 open pages of, details about different sales and all that kind of stuff. We actually had very senior members of the Bush administration call and thank us because it forced the Pakistanis to arrest A.Q. Khan. And they actually had, the guts to say, we didn't think that this would result, which is one of the reasons we were absolutely no help. So when we did a documentary about it, they actually did go on TV and go do it. But what that tells you is there are a lot of third-party countries that get a lot of this data, and you're much more likely to get it out of them. The IAEA in those days, the International Atomic Energy Agency, was a wide open place that had no classified anything. And so you could get a lot of the US briefings there. That's a lot harder today, post-Iran. Anybody who hadn't had a question, because I can only take one more, and yeah.
Honestly, you criticize the JCPOA as not perfect. That's not surprising. But what would you say most troubled you about it that you think was gettable? I mean, obviously, the whole problem is, right, you're in negotiation. So do you think that they failed on some level?
I mean, it's very hard for me to second guess the negotiators if you're not actually in the room. But I will say this, I think Secretary Kerry did not do a good job of convincing the external audience that he was a tough, canny, uncompromising negotiator, right? I mean, you wouldn't think of Jim Baker and John Kerry in the same category. Now, how different the deal would have looked if Jim Baker had negotiated it as opposed to John Kerry, it's very hard to say. But the biggest concession we made, in my view, was to basically allow Iran to continue to do research and development on advanced centrifuge machines, even when they were limited in terms of deploying them. And then after 10 years, they're allowed to begin replacing the current generation of machines, which are very inefficient, with these more advanced machines. So, I always...
Year 15, all the limits.
And then year 15, all the limits are... So, look, I think buying time is good, and usually that's the best thing you can do in, international diplomacy. But 10 years is actually not very long in the lifespan of a nation, and I just wonder whether we might have been able to get a little bit longer constraints.
And were you involved in persuading the Israelis not to bomb?
Well, certainly in the first Obama administration, there was a very, yes, but yeah, I don't think my voice mattered very much, but but this was a full court press.
Yeah.
That the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, CIA Director.
And they really were going to do it, and you really
Well,
stopped.
I don't
know
know.
it's hard to know. Isn't
I
it?
don't know. It's hard to know. I mean, there were different views about how serious it was and how much of it was a gimmick. I think there was one moment where they seemed to me like they were really looking for a green light.
I agree.
But I've always thought that Prime Minister Netanyahu's best scenario was to engineer a U.S. attack on Iran. And I think he hasn't, I think that continues to be his best scenario. I think his hope is that he can engineer a collapse of the JCPOA and that the Iranians, which I don't think they'll do, I think the Iranians will be careful, but that the Iranians will then resume the nuclear program in a way that forces President Trump to attack them. I think that's Bibi's hope, if he continues in office for much longer. Which I don't know. I don't know what you think, but it looks to me like he's in pretty deep trouble.
Well, yeah, that's all.
Different subject.
You have to talk about it, but nobody else.
Second seminar. Well, thank you, Gary. This has been terrific. Thank all of you and for your great questions. And we look forward to starting this up tomorrow. So thanks again.
Thank you all.